planning for biodiversity. We don't really have time to look at these. They're just two last slides. But the lessons learnt is really just a synopsis of the ones that we've gone through from the other cities. But you'll see there adding value to what the cities were doing already in terms of biodiversity, adding a political dimension, political clout to those cities, and a sense of global citizenship. The need to recognize the value and importance of global networks and animating those networks to add value to the work that's being done at city level. And I think this was a very successful example of a global network which was more than the sum of its parts. And the take-home message, finally, is that communication is key, and essentially much of lab was about communicating intra-cities amongst ourselves, and then with each other, and then with partners that were party to the lab experience, agencies, foundations, sponsors, civil society. And I've said that moving away from conventional governance wisdom to discover what really works is perhaps what we've got to be addressing. We heard this from Harriet. I can't see Harriet earlier this morning. But find out what the formula is for success, and then see if we can tap that formula for success and apply it to whatever we're doing. So to apply it to integrating biodiversity to cities, some of the YouTube has been remarkably successful. One of the phenomenon of our time, the 10-cent or is it 2-cent mobile service system. And in Cape Town, at the recent FIFA Soccer World Cup, we found that our fan walk was unexpectedly enormously successful. We had hundreds of thousands of people coming to a certain place just to walk to the stadium, even though they didn't have tickets. Nobody quite understood exactly why it was so successful, but it was. And if we can really look at the way we work, the way we communicate, and tap into those formulas of success, perhaps we'll have a lift-off, and we will start to really change the way the world thinks and the way the world operates, and really add some substance to what we're doing. Thanks very much indeed.
Great. Thanks for that, Stephen. Now we come to probably the most important person on the panel today, because we can talk about ecosystem services as a concept, we can launch international programs, but at the end of the day, someone has to do the work. And our next speaker is just that person, Richard Boone. He's a local government practitioner. He represents that group of people who work at the coalface where the rubber hits the road. We've got to take all of these grand ideas and make them work in very difficult circumstances, particularly in the cities of the global south. So Richard today has our reality check. He's going to highlight some of the highs and lows of taking these concepts and making them work in the real world. Thanks.
Thanks, Debra. Afternoon, everybody. As Debra says, I'm a local government practitioner feeling mildly uncomfortable amongst a whole bunch of very erudite academics, but certainly very passionate about my job. I essentially work for Debra for the local authority in Durban, which is better known, well, at home as eThekwini Municipality. And we're a department of about 25 to 30 nowadays, but as little as 10 years ago there were actually 4 of us. We have a current budget, this is just to give you some context, of around $1.5 million as a department. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially the work of the department, although there are bits and pieces that feed in from other departments within the city towards our overall biodiversity conservation efforts. So essentially that's by way of context. So just quickly, briefly to tell us about Durban, our eThekwini municipal area is 2,300 square kilometers in extent, and about 2/3 of that is in fact rural under traditional authority leadership. So we have a system of chiefs And what happens in that 66% of the city is pretty much just as much their decision as it is local government's decisions. Big tension between traditional leadership and democratically elected leadership in South Africa, certainly in our province. The population of the city, 3.5 million, and 2005 our average per capita income was US $715, so you can see on average people are not particularly wealthy. Very high unemployment levels in the city, and massive backlog in terms of service delivery, potable water, electricity, etc. There have been massive advances, but the one area where we seem to lag dramatically is around provision of adequate housing. So the informal settlement or squatter settlement that you see on the banks of one of our rivers there's a program in place to address that and to essentially build houses where appropriate in situ, alternatively on greenfield sites, to provide those 370,000 houses. And at the moment, in a good year, our housing department is providing the order of 16,000 houses, and you can see the numbers. It's going to take a hang of a long time to provide the houses for the people that need them. And then Durban is South Africa's major port city. And just quickly on the biodiversity, we also located in a global biodiversity hotspot. Ours is called the Maputaland, Ponderland, Albany biodiversity hotspot. Essentially runs from just north of Maputo in southern Mozambique down to East London in our Eastern Cape province. And Durban is situated pretty much in the middle of that biodiversity hotspot on the coast. We have within our municipal boundary 10 vegetation types and 17 significant rivers and 16 estuaries. And one of the relevances of the rivers is that we have a very deeply incised landscape, so topographically quite diverse, ranging from sea level to 800 meters above sea level in the space of about 30 kilometers. And that provides all sorts of challenges around finding physically developable land. So we have very deeply incised landscapes. Within our municipal boundaries, we have over 2,000 plant species recorded, which is 10% of the Southern African flora, which is in itself 10% of the world's flora. So a very, very high level of plant species diversity. And then 80 plus mammals or 350 plus bird species. Alongside that high biodiversity, we have very high levels of historical and current land transformation. So the picture on the screen on the left, you can see the green bits are the pieces that are essentially untransformed. That was in 2003. We have a more modern land cover map, and it hasn't changed that dramatically. And those green bits are essentially the tribal areas that I referred to earlier. And the T shape that you see, or the T on its side, the coastal development, and then a strip going inland towards Johannesburg, form essentially white and Indian areas which are much more highly developed. Okay. The transformation in Durban in the past historically was due to essentially sugarcane production, but nowadays urban development is replacing that sugar quite rapidly. We have the other typical threats that our biodiversity faces: invasive alien species, obviously climate change, in our part of the world overexploitation. So a lot of people actually physically live off the biodiversity, in particular for fuel, possibly for medicinal plants, and large numbers of plants are harvested in the wild for that purpose. And then pollution. Overall transformation in the city is around 50%, but certain vegetation types are going up to 70 or 80%. And that transformation figure is an underestimate in the sense that it doesn't really look at the quality of the vegetation that remains. So it's just as simple what's been replaced as opposed to what the quality of what remains is. We have an open space plan in Durban, and we have had one since the 1970s. So we've been doing this for a long time, not myself personally, but various role players over the years. The initial open space plans for Durban were developed by a non-governmental organization, and soon thereafter, perhaps in the 5 or 6 years after, the city took over that role and has been doing it ever since. Our open space plan is known as the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System. And the early versions were just really about nature conservation, and they're based on expert opinion, so people knew sites to be rich in biodiversity, and they would make a case for the conservation of those sites, and in some cases were successful, and nature reserves were established. Then in 1994 we had our democratic elections, and obviously the first democratic elections in South Africa, and the new government that moved in, the new local government, really had to address the dire needs of the population of Durban, and clearly the priorities had to shift, and they shifted into service delivery and housing. And very, very quickly the open space system, which in circles prior to that were quite highly revered, became seen as an obstacle to development within the city, and the politicians coined the term demon as opposed to demos. So we literally found ourselves within a space of 4 years, turnaround, all of a sudden we were on the back foot, and our open space plan was under a lot of pressure. So fortunately, at around about that time, the concept of ecosystem goods and services reached us in Durban through one of our consultants, and we realized there was an opportunity to repackage the open space system and in a such much more sincere way understand the broader role that open space could provide to our citizens, and essentially then started to plan our open space system around the delivery of ecosystem goods and services as well as biodiversity conservation. So current versions of our Metropolitan Open Space Plan are in fact developed based on systematic conservation planning techniques, and those build in the delivery of ecosystem goods and services as well as biodiversity conservation objectives. The plan, you can see there's a graphic of it there on the left-hand side of the screen. The open space plan essentially is attempting to conserve in the order of 33% of the municipal land surface area. In fact, also water bodies as well. So that sounds like a big bite out of the development opportunities within Durban, but as I mentioned before, we have quite an extreme topography, so in fact much of that land is physically undevelopable. So we have an aim as a department, and perhaps more broadly as a city, to efficiently conserve our biodiversity pattern and process and the supply of ecosystem goods and services by securing the sites that have been identified within the open space system and then managing those same sites. And just to give you a sense of how far we've got to go, essentially about 11% is either managed or zoned for conservation, and we've got as you can see, 89% of the land has no management or no conservation zoning as such. It's not protected at all. As I mentioned earlier, we reconceptualized our open space system and its values, and one of the first things we did was we attempted just very crudely to generate a value for our open space system. So what was it delivering in terms of economic value? And at the time, we've actually done the exercise twice, once in 1999 and a little later in 2003, and we're due for an update now. But the goods and services delivered by the open space system, which I showed you a short while ago, were estimated at very conservatively around $440 million per annum. And that excluded at the time the contribution that our open space system made to the tourism sector within Durban, which itself was worth around $470 million at that time. And just to give you a sense of the contribution relative to the municipal operating capital budget, you can see the figures there. So clearly the open space system as a piece of green infrastructure was playing quite an important role. That value, even though it was done fairly coarsely, has in fact been widely used. For example, in our strategic business plan, it's widely used by senior officials and politicians, and in fact has never been challenged. And I guess important point is that one doesn't always have to go overboard in terms of providing information or backing the information, provided you have a sort of a reasonable defensible argument. People were prepared to accept the order of magnitude figures that we were able to provide. Right now, just as Debra mentioned, the implementation. In fact, this is the part which I find most interesting, is actually really getting in and getting your hands dirty on a daily basis. But so step by step, basically what we've done, and just to give you a quick overview, there are other bits and pieces which aren't included here. The first thing we had to do was to make sure that our open space system has been integrated into all our spatial plans in the city. And the picture on the left, the graphic on the left, is our spatial development framework, which sits in our strategic business plan of the city. And as you can see, our DMOS layer has been included, and as it has been included in the full hierarchy of plans, barring our town planning schemes. And at the moment, town planning schemes have absolutely no reference to the environment, and we hopefully will close a project on Thursday coming where we hope our council will start to adopt a recommendation which says that our DMOS layer needs to be fully integrated into town planning schemes. And the importance of that will be that any development which takes place or is proposed within that DMOS layer, much of which is privately owned, will have to undergo some form of environmental impact assessment, a scaled-down version of an environmental impact assessment. As I mentioned, we have, through the environmental impact assessment, we have within our own department a team of folk who assess all planning and or environmental impact assessment applications on land which falls within the DMOS. And the typical outcomes of those applications are a whole series of conditions of approval, which include management responsibilities for the landowner, the registration of conservation servitudes on conservation-worthy parts of their land, and in some instances, as a tool of last resort, offset payments or offset contributions in one way or another. So the picture on the bottom right shows a residential development in a high conservation or important conservation area, and the red hatching indicates the area that was set aside for conservation, so it remains in private ownership, and the collective homeowners association are now responsible for managing that open space and for zoning that open space for conservation purposes in perpetuity. We have an enforcement function within our department. It is a small fledgling function. It struggles with an important point which I hadn't mentioned up to now, is that constitutionally the nature conservation responsibilities are in fact in South Africa the responsibility of province and national government as opposed to local government, although pretty much every local government has some involvement in nature conservation activities. The problem with enforcement is we have no laws as local government that we can directly enforce. And so our enforcement officer really plays a lobbying role. Enforcement officers play lobbying roles to try and get other government departments to act. Okay, then we have another tool which is we're using, which are scheme amendments, and this is something which really it's quite exciting, sort of a bucking bronco ride in a sense. What we're doing here is, in the graphic on the top left, we've got a whole range of private properties surrounding a conservation asset which is in private ownership. And our town planning schemes in Durban, certainly, and I think probably the same for the rest of South Africa, were developed decades ago before environment was a consideration. And what we're trying to do as a city or as a department is to retrofit our town planning schemes. So we are in the process of de-zoning or removing development rights or notional development rights on properties, and leaving portions of those properties residential and portions of those properties zoned to conservation. So in other words, we split zoning those properties. And as a pilot, we're working on 1,800 properties in a very pressurized part of our city, development pressures and high biodiversity conservation value. And as you can imagine, that starts to infringe on some people's perception of what their property rights might be. And that's brought all sorts of lawyers out of the woodwork, because there's obviously lots of money to be made here. And again, we're hoping that this pilot project will be adopted on Thursday next week, so we will have the rezoning in place. Where we have properties which are completely affected, so in other words, we aren't able to leave them with any residential opportunity in this instance, then we're obliged, it's effectively an expropriation, and we're obliged to purchase those properties. And example would be